we can communicate. So let's ensure that we really communicate today. We are all on Twitter, I'm sure I can see. So let's make this forum trend today. And I am going to appeal that whatever is being said, if possible, can we post on @Perspec1, @AfricanPerspec1. Secondly, you know all the different Twitter accounts of AU, particularly the ones that are related to what we are doing today, so that we can be able to communicate with the entire continent and people in the diaspora. Secondly, I'm going to ensure that I give you enough time as delegates to make input, and I'm definitely sure that the panelists here will be up to the task in terms of directing the conversation and responding and perhaps molding the inputs. So I'm going to start with comments. Africa is one of the fastest growing regions economically, but the question is in whose interest? The current geopolitics have led to Africa being the best destination for international investment currently. But the challenge facing the world, the multilateralism, have also led to world looking for Africa for investment. For example, American President Donald Trump's America First policy is inward looking, and those who are doing business with America are now looking for markets outside America, and many are looking at Africa. The rise of right-wing organizations and the developments in Europe, such as Brexit. Currently, Britain is looking at strengthening its relation, not at multilateral trade, but at bilateral trade. And it's clearly looking at the continent, Africa, because Britain is our former colonizer in most countries. We as Africans have to be vigilant that all these dynamics do not leave us with the scars of corruption as the new scramble for Africa is unfolding in front of our eyes. In 2015, the former South African president, who was tasked with the responsibility to lead a AU high-level panel on illicit financial flow, found out that Africa loses $50 billion each year through illicit financial flows. I just want to quote what he said. He said, "Corruption is a cross-cutting and an integral part of IFFS because of its facilitating role. Corruption in the form of abuse of entrusted power to private benefit in both the public and private sectors thus remain an issue of continued concerns." Close quote. The reality is, it is women who will be mostly affected by these developments that I've spoken about, whether positively or negatively. For example, the scramble for Africa, are women going to benefit, or this will result in another form of corruption, and women will bear the brunt? It is for this reason that women on the continent and in the diaspora must take a lead in fighting corruption and hold administrations accountable. And that's what this session is all about. Independent institutions which fight corruption and demand an enforcement accountability are key to any society. We need those institutions. And can women access those institutions? But how can we make such institutions accessible to women? That's the question we have to answer. How can we empower women to report corruption and be brave to demand accountability? Former South African public protector Thuli Madonsela once said, "Corruption steals the dreams of the nation." We all know that. It starts with active citizens that are the first to lay the building blocks for the country that they want. We have to build the Africa we want. We either build an Africa that is corrupt or Africa that is free from corruption. As they take personal responsibility to build the future they want, citizens should ensure that they elect competent and committed leaders to manage public power and resource while simultaneously holding such people accountable. So, we have to be active citizens on the continent. Now, I am going to ask the team here, our panel, to introduce themselves in a minute, and then we'll get to the comments later. Let's start with who you are, what are you doing in your respective countries, and how is this relevant to what you are doing? Let's start, Lovania. Hello.
that in Africa we are undertaking some developments, and in whose interest are we undertaking those developments? And you cited some examples about what is happening in the West, and some rhetorical statements that were made by highly placed individuals out there. So, yes, we are undertaking these developments, or we're supposed to undertake these developments in the interest of our respective citizens. But I would like to say that we cannot undertake such developments if we have an imbalanced situation. Imbalanced situation that is created by some corrupt practices, where some of our nationals are deprived of the opportunity to participate in the development because of corruption. Yes, I think listening to the debate starting from yesterday to today, that corruption and gender inequality is there, it's real. That has been confirmed. But again, what has to be said is that both men and women are affected by corruption. But of course, there is some different degrees how each are affected. The most unfortunate thing is that in Botswana, at least as far as I'm aware, there is lack of data to qualify or quantify the extent of gender-based corruption. But certainly there is a common understanding that it does exist. And I'm going to narrate those areas where I believe it does exist and there is that inequality. Gender inequality breeds corruption, and vice versa. Corruption tends to exacerbate gender inequality. There is a common understanding, of course, again in Botswana, that in the scheme of things, women are by nature more exposed and vulnerable to corrupt practices more than men. And this is how it happens, I would say. Women are more likely to be asked for sexual favors in exchange for work, promotion, training, and other favors, including bribery, than men. That's a fact. They can even be subjected to malicious transfers, even to remote areas, for refusing to submit themselves to sexual demands for those in possession of, from those in possession of higher places. At least I can say this from my experience as a former director of the DCEC. On the one hand, those who submit themselves to sexual demands from person in higher authority also compromise efficiency and effective service delivery in the workplace, because they are not appointed or promoted on the basis of merit and qualification. This kind of practices further marginalize the already vulnerable women living in poverty by putting basic public service and goods out of their reach. And therefore, they cannot be expected to contribute towards the development that we undertake. That is the point I'm making. Corruption culminating in sexual favors can lead to unfair competition, where promotions and other amenities are made on the basis of favoritism, or in case where those overtures were refused, victimization, denial of for equal opportunities, leading to moral low morale and depression, and can destroy the capacity of individuals in the organization, especially the honest one, with skills and qualification to perform to their full potential. So, in that case, development are compromised. Such behavior tends to lower the status of the women in the society generally. So they become, or they think that they are second citizens instead of considering themselves as first citizens. So the most unfortunate thing is that these acts go unreported due to their pervasive and secretive nature, stigma and shame associated with them. So monitoring sometimes becomes very difficult. How you can monitor those activities. But of course they need to be exposed one way or the other. Because in the current era of development, we cannot certainly continue this way. We need to break the past. Men also have to take a responsibility and accountability on issues of equality and accountability to deliver hope to the future generation so that we can undertake this development that we are talking about. So similarly, corruption would not and does not hold any future for any civilized society. Similarly, inequality robs country of its development efforts and initiatives due to lack of participation by citizens. So we cannot afford to have one section of the society having a monopoly in participation. Right. I can see Madam Rita here is, I'm running out of time. But in the context of Botswana, already we have a women gender affairs department in the Ministry of Nationality and Immigration. And again, that is pushing the whole agenda of empowering women. The issue of how do we make women to comfortably report corruption. We have the Whistleblowing Act, which has just been promulgated. Yes, it has its own weaknesses here and there, but it is work in progress. And again, if you look at our Vision 2036, where it talks about, I think it is pillar number 4, it talks about governance, peace, and security. It envisages Botswana as a land of peace, freedom, and progressive governance. And it focuses on combating corruption by involving all key stakeholders, including all its citizens. So, from the Botswana perspective, you can say, yes, it is progress, it is work in progress, and I think we are getting there. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you, Ntate. I think the important issues you touched on, one is the issue of inclusivity. When you talk about inclusivity, you talk about women in particular because they are in most cases marginalized, and no country can prosper when it excludes the majority. And then the issue of information, you know, I think the third speaker will touch on what they have done in terms of ensuring that we have a proper information in terms of the link between corruption and gender issues. And then the issue of, I like the issue of the 2036 program of action in Botswana, which speaks to, we know that where there are conflicts, corruption thrive, and know that in this case women are always vulnerable, running around bring babies. Over to you, Ntate.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Okay, thank you, Madam Moderator. Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, you know, when we talk about gender-sensitive reporting mechanisms for combating corruption, it goes to the entire root of all that we've been talking about over the past day and a half. And, you know, it goes to some of the critical leverage areas that are available for fighting corruption, while at the same time mainstreaming best practices in terms of women empowerment, particularly the role of women in fighting corruption. I just wanted to quickly just take you through what the Gender Scorecard sought to do, and then from that research project, which involves looking at the practices within and the status quo within 55 African countries, to share some of the snippets from that study. Essentially, I mean, the Gender Scorecard has about 25 indicators that cut across 5 performance areas. The performance areas relate to, firstly, the level of ratification and reporting of key normative framework on both the fight against corruption and mainstreaming gender equality and women's rights. Secondly, looking at progress, you know, looking at how national anti-corruption systems mainstream gender equality and women's rights. And one of the key issues here is, you know, to what extent are the institutions involved, cross-pollinating and working together, or are they working in silos? So you find that in many countries, the gender ministries are not involved in the processes for developing national anti-corruption strategies. And then when you talk about national anti-corruption strategies, that's the coherent document that pulls in the SWOT analysis of the fight against corruption, who's doing what are the key players, the budgets, and so on. And this is an area that requires perhaps more involvement, particularly from the gender ministries on the one hand, and also the national human rights institutions being brought to the table during the development and the implementation of those national anti-corruption strategies. The scorecard also looks at access to key public services that are pertinent for women empowerment and the protection of women's rights. It also looks at the protection of witnesses and whistleblowers, the enabling environment for addressing gender-specific forms of corruption. We've spoken a lot over the past day and a half around sextortion or sexual exploitation, which has similar ingredients in law as sexual harassment. But we haven't said, hardly have we mentioned another gender-specific type of corruption that really does impact upon women, and this is human trafficking, which is becoming very topical now in Africa, with open slave markets being revealed by the CNN in certain quarters. Also, the scorecard also seeks to understand the availability of spaces in terms of voice and accountability, the participation of civil society organizations, citizens, the private sector, etc., in the fight against corruption. It also looks at strengthening domestic resource mobilization, specifically on the effective management of transfer pricing risk and anti-money laundering measures, as well as the legal frameworks for asset recovery. The scorecard also looks at the strengthening, how countries are, and how member states are strengthening the implementation of the national anti-corruption policies in terms of the government effectiveness, how they're controlling corruption, and the ease of doing business, which is one sector that affects a whole lot of women, particularly when you look at the economic rights. Now, the purpose is not to rank countries, but to provide the opportunity to have easily accessible monitoring and accountability tools for member states to discern their progress in terms of implementing the gender equality and women's rights commitments. Now, a couple of key areas that I just wanted to quickly highlight. You see, although both the UN Convention and the Against Corruption and the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption provide mandatory provisions for member states in terms of protecting through legislative and other measures, witnesses, victims, experts informants, whistleblowers, will report or testify in cases of corruption or related offenses. And this kind of protection would relate also to protection from retaliation, intimidation, or fear of consequent reprisals. Now, when you look at how African countries are faring generally, you know, the research hasn't been concluded, so I can't give you specifics, but I can just share some of the snippets that's coming through. You can see that only about 40% of African countries have adequate legal frameworks for protecting witnesses, experts, victims, and informants. And protection for these categories of people varying at different stages in terms of development for the other countries. Similarly, just over 30% of African countries have adequate legal frameworks for protection of whistleblowers. As I mentioned yesterday from the floor, from studies from the Afrobarometer and the Global Corruption Barometer, the police is perceived to be the most corrupt public service in Africa. And the reality is this, is that the average woman whose right is being violated, the average woman who, the average woman in the Clapham Omnibus who's privy to an act of corruption or a related offense may not have access to the National Anti-Corruption Agency or authority, but may immediately, their first point of call is the police. And if the police have, perceived to be the most corrupt public service in Africa, that's very problematic. And closely following the police is the courts. The courts are seen to be the second most corrupt institution or public service provided on the continent. Now, in addition, I just wanted also to just share a couple of figures as well, particularly when you consider gender-specific forms of corruption with sextortion, sexual exploitation, and human trafficking. If you look at the results from the Women Business and Law Index 2018, only 65% of African countries have legislation on sexual harassment in the employment sector. And only about 24% of member states have such legal frameworks in the education sector. Also, just over 50% of member states have criminal penalties for sexual harassment in the employment sector. And only 24% of member states have civil remedies for sexual harassment in the employment sector. Finally, it's important to note that no African country has attained a tier 1 status in terms of complying with the minimum standards of combating human trafficking. Now, when you look at all these statistics, it shows that there's a lot of work to be done. A lot of work, because when we talk about how do we provide the space for women and protect and provide a space for gender-sensitive reporting mechanisms in terms of combating corruption, we can talk about rhetorics, but it's these key institutions. If these key institutions and these key mechanisms, as provided by the regional and international normative frameworks, if these key mechanisms are working, then we've got a critical leverage point to support gender-sensitive reporting in the fight against corruption. Thank you.
Thank you. We now know what's happening on the ground, but the question is, how do we address this? How do we turn the situation around, which speaks to what we are about in this panel? And over to you.
I'm briefly going to give a grassroots perspective. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to come up with particular projects or programs that affect women, and we ensure that you get the women themselves to monitor particular service delivery, especially in the health sector. And this we're able to do looking at quite a number of districts within my country. And what we did was to identify what you'd call community-based monitors. And these are local grassroots women that are in respective villages, and empower them, we're able to give them phones, and with the mobile phones, we're able to report particular corruption cases or incidents that they would come face to face when they were probably monitoring health centers. And again, we decided to look at health, especially health centers, because we know that a biggest percentage of people that you'll find in health centers are women. When a child falls sick, it is the woman. When the woman falls sick, she takes care of herself. When the man falls sick, it is the woman that is taking care of this man. So we know that if there are no drugs within health centers in one way or the other, the woman is going to be affected. And one of the things we decided to do was to empower them, give them information, and connect them to the duty bearers. Because whenever they gathered information, they were able to share this information with the key duty bearers that were able to bring about change within the areas where they're working. And the key issue for me, it's empowering the women. I think it is empowering and empowering and empowering them. It's not all about, well, that's my perspective. It isn't about ensuring that you have very many women in particular leaders, particular positions of authority, if they're not empowered. Because we've seen situations whereby you have very many women. I mean, quite a number of our laws have particular provisions whereby a particular percentage is supposed to be women. But if these women are not empowered, their contribution will actually not be taken on by their male counterparts. If they're not empowered enough, they won't be able to stand their ground on particular issues. I know there's research that has been done that, and we're looking at Nordic countries and particular African countries, where in Nordic countries, they increased the number of women in particular positions of authority, and the levels of corruption were able to go down. Why? Because the systems were working. So if you have a number of women engaged in the fight against corruption, but systems and the laws are not working, then we won't really see a very big change. And they brought in another African context whereby, yes, the number of women in particular African countries was increased. But surprisingly, the levels of corruption didn't go down because the systems that were meant to curb corruption were actually not working. Those that were meant to fight to eradicate corruption were themselves corrupt. So it's going to be very important that systems are working hand in hand, women are empowered, and one of the issues we're supposed to talk about is existing mechanisms for women to report. I highly doubt whether those mechanisms are in place. What I know is that we all access the same mechanisms that are out there, especially if a person is going to report corruption at a particular police station. I don't think there's a desk that has been created for women to actually report. In most cases, everyone goes and reports to the same police officer or to the same magistrate or judge, depending on the number of cases that they need to handle. Lastly, it is very important to bring men on board. One of the things we did when we were handling this gender project was to engage and involve their husbands. Because remember, we had women going out of their homes, going to monitor particular health centers, and ideally, and you're giving a woman a phone. So I had issues whereby men were not comfortable when their women were given the phones. So through the project, and at times you would call this phone and to be the guy to pick it up. So one of the things we decided to do is how do we bring them on board in order for them to understand what the women were doing. And in the process, of course, most of them raised quite a number of issues. Some of them were able to see the results. They were actually able to appreciate the program more. So if we are talking of issues regarding gender and corruption and bringing on board more women, we cannot do this in isolation of the men. Thank you.
Earlier on during the session, there was a heated debate whether having more women is going to assist in terms of the continent combating corruption. And the buzzword was educate, educate, empower, empower. Let me start with you in Mauritius. Looking at what you said earlier on, that there's a ministry that deals with women and gender issues, but they tend to focus on violence against women. You had a privilege to have a president, a woman president. Can you tell us the experience so that we can link this issue of whether having women in these positions does bring change, or is it a question of what quality do you bring as a woman and you're conscious in terms of when you are given that responsibility, the issue of was she empowered enough to understand that if she fails, many women are going to fail. And here we are in the continent right now, we are struggling.
In Mauritius, we used to believe that women were less likely to be corrupt because we don't take risk. So if you don't take risk, you won't go and commit an offense. This is what we thought was the case. And then we started having women in positions of power. We had, for the first time, a lady president we were proud of. And then all went wrong. She had to step down because she went on a shopping spree using a credit card which had been handed over to her by a private entity. And the founder of a private entity is alleged to be involved in money laundering from Angola. So then we had to reassess our beliefs that women were less corrupt than men. And that was not the end of it. Our gender minister, who was also a lady, she had to be sacked because during the exercise of a commission of inquiry on drugs, because in Mauritius there is much drug trafficking, she was found to have visited drug peddlers and drug barons in the prisons regularly. She even visited 30 drug barons in one day. Those are still allegations. They are not proved yet, but I'm telling you the facts as exposed by the report of a commission of inquiry for you to realize that it was a lady. We have more examples. I can give you more examples of women who have come in power but who have failed us completely. So now we are still in this situation that we have to reflect on that and say to ourselves, how do we empower women who are honest? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, how do we empower those who are honest? Perhaps they were not empowered enough to realize that what they are doing or what they were embarking on was going to have negative consequences for women on the continent where our leadership is now in question. Ntate, you spoke about the issue of sexual favors, which is part of corruption because it's not based on person's skills and capabilities, but it is a favor which leads to a situation where it's almost like nepotism. At the end of the day, that person will feel that she or he owes that person a lot and she can allow corruption. How do we deal with issue of, sexual favors being used to corrupt women? How do we empower women to realize that you must say no, you must get that job because you deserve to get that job? How can we empower women to be able to say no, but to be able to report such acts and those who are fingered are held to account? Because the question is, yes, we know this is happening, but how do we report? How do we empower women to report, but also the perpetrators to be held accountable?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I think the buzzword here should be strengthen institutions. The buzzword should be inculcate value systems in the institutions that we operate. Let us inject a sense of integrity in the institutions that we we operate. In our Public Service Act, we have a provision that deals with sexual harassment. But the question is it being utilized effectively such that women would feel free to report? I must confess that I don't think so, because of the stigma that is associated with the sexual harassment issues. So, again, I would want to observe that Ghana, we have a gender department in the Ministry of Nationality and Gender Affairs. And also we have a council, board of directors, is it? What they call it, an NGO council, where all NGOs are subscribing, and also they have to come together, discuss issues across all sectors of the economy, including women empowerment and even issues of gender violence and et cetera, et cetera. So I would suggest that maybe we need to also look at these institutions, see how they can infuse anti-corruption programs in their operations and activities, so that, again, they create a conducive environment where women can report. Or we also put up some counseling centers where women can go and feel free to report, and or even be assisted to report that kind of cases. I think that is the only way. But first and foremost, let us endeavor to inculcate a value system in our operations or institutions.
Thank you, Ndate. You spoke about the numbers here, and you gave us a percentage in terms of the commitment by countries to subscribe to these frameworks. It's quite depressing to see that there's no movement on the continent. How can we ensure that member countries do sign up to these frameworks, and they are not only signing up, but also there's implementation? We can have good legislations, we can have good institutions. If they are not put to use, it's just as good as not having those institutions and those legislations. How do we empower women on the continent to push for countries to comply, but also to ensure that practically we are doing what needs to be done?
Thank you, moderator, Madam Moderator. Interesting. I mean, it's easier said than done, to be honest with you. There's a whole lot of dynamics at play that create the beast that we know as corruption. And you know, it's not one size fits all. Africa is not a heterogeneous place. You know, you've got 55 countries with their peculiarities, etc. But I think, you know, I think you've actually hit the nail on the head with your question. We need political will. And I would like to refine our executives. We need our judiciary, and we need the different institutions in the whole value chain of fighting corruption and promoting gender equality and protecting women's rights. We need all these institutions, first of all, to commit fully. And these can only be done if the tone is set at the top. You know, we say in corporate governance that the fish rots from the head. So we need informed political will. We need and that political will then gets sort of like filtered through the spirit, and my colleague from Botswana has talked about the value system. You know, if that gets infused in terms of the value system, what is the value system that the police in Africa is operating with? I mean, probably not Botswana, because if you look at the results, Botswana, you know, is kind of like almost squeaky clean. You know, in terms of police corruption, it's not that a big problem here. But I mean, if you look at a country like Nigeria, that the survey from global, from Afrobarometer shows that Nigeria's police is actually perceived in the study of about 34 countries to be, you know, to have the least integrity. What is the value system that is pervasive throughout the whole police service in Nigeria, if I may ask? You know, how do they see themselves? Do they see themselves as, you know, a unit that upholds law enforcement, that protects the rights of individual citizens and gives the opportunity for individual citizens to come up and report transgressions, you know, on corruption or related offenses? These are, I think, some of the key issues. It must start from political leadership. I think also that civil society have a critical role to play, and that's why the scorecard also looks at you know, the spaces for voice and accountability. The civil society, private sector play a very huge role in this, and their involvement both in terms of developing the policy framework and the implementation of those policy frameworks is absolutely critical. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Let's move to the grassroots. We know that those who are educated, those who live in suburbs are privileged in terms of accessing information and perhaps facilities to be able to deal with this challenge of corruption. They are able to access institutions that deals with corruption. But in the rural countryside, it's very difficult. You spoke about how you have ensured that women are empowered and are capacitated in terms of dealing with these challenges. But the reality is there are no resources. What can we do as a continent to extend these resources? Because I know you might be doing this, but perhaps it's just a small reach. You still have to reach many more women in your country, but around you know, the world, or I can say on the continent. How do you ensure that there are resources available to extend this good work?
Well, the issue of resources will always be a challenge because you never find sufficient resources. But I think what needs to be done is, one, how do we ensure that in our programming that we do as probably NGOs, how do we ensure that there's sustainability of some of these practices that we start up? In most cases, some of the interventions are donor-based, and when the project comes to an end, the project also dies. So the key issue I think that we need to do is, even with the meager resources that we may have, how do we ensure that there is sustainability? And you can only do sustainability if there's ownership of the program or of the project. In most cases, again, do we involve these women when we are designing some of these programs or these projects? If they're not involved, then obviously, if the project cycle comes to an end, even the monitors that you had will also go. So the key issue that needs to be done is at program or project design, it's always going to be very important that you bring on board the beneficiaries. And the other issue that we haven't really talked about so much, which I think is important, is religion and culture. We talk about all these things of gender, but we know that it does originate from culture, it does originate from religion. And how do we work with religious bodies? How do we work with cultural organizations to ensure that the message we continuously talk about is continued? Because in Africa, again, we all have or come from particular cultures. We all subscribe to particular religions. So how do we work with the religious bodies to ensure that they also buy into our message? We know that religious bodies are these type of bodies that will meet people on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, because we know right from Friday, Saturday, Sunday, people are flocking. places of worship, if not actually on a daily. So how do we tap into this other existing but free space to ensure that these religious leaders or cultural leaders, influential as they are, they're able to buy into our programs, our projects, and that way the issue of resources may not really be so much of a problem. So I think for me, by and large, the key issue is tapping into other spaces which you haven't yet thought about.
Now a very important moment where delegates must have their say, ask questions or make input. I'm going to open the floor. I'm going to start here. The Supreme Court, Constitution, Ethiopia, I think we touched on the issue of the judiciary. I think judiciary has a role to play to empower women in ensuring that the environment is conducive for them, because they know action will be taken. I'll start here, and then the lady here, the gentleman there, there's a lady there up at the back, and the gentleman here. So let's start here.
Thank you. Okay, I just, it's not a comment or a question, I just need their opinions. We are talking about reporting mechanisms of women, and my standing or my opinion is if the government institutions or other private organizations are not free from corruption or put a system that let women able to report corruption and demand accountability, how can we rush to something that doesn't exist in the system in the first place, which doesn't accommodate women empowerment? So to solve this problem, we should either empower women to be in that position or create an institution who can accommodate such system. So the problem is there, we know, but we talked yesterday that we should empower women to be in that public institutions. Today we are talking about how we help women to corruption is affecting women. So whom do we are going to report our problems? For example, let me raise an example in Ethiopia. Our health organization promotes breastfeeding until 6 months because of for the child's health sake or something. On the other hand, when you go to the labor law, it gives only 4 months leave. So the system is negating with each other, and how can we talk about reporting before we solve the problem? Because they say one quotation, and I like that quotation, because if we know the problem, we are solving half of the problem. So we need the institutions to be free from corruption in the first place before we go to the reporting.
How do we clean the institutions to ensure that when people report corruption, they are confident that the matter will be dealt with? Your question?
Thank you. Actually, I have Karima from Morocco. Actually, I have 2 questions. Questions for the speakers and also maybe for the audience. My question is, what are the reporting mechanisms, whether formal or informal, that worked or not worked, and why? And how do we match these mechanisms with society's reaction and reception with these mechanisms? Because sometimes we have advanced tools and mechanisms, but needs more time for society to fully understand them, embrace them, and use them. So the pace is different. Also, how do we ensure the identity of the people who report about corruption is protected by law? How do we justify in case of retaliation of abuse, and how this could be included in the penal code or other legislation to ensure that a transparent judiciary lawsuit? My second question is related to sexual favor, and I think here this is a serious problem that we're still talking about it. Let's say it's still taboo in many societies, and it is prevailing across all sectors. And unfortunately, sometimes those who are supposed to apply the law and protect people are the first ones who are violating it. So my question is, regardless of the legislations, to develop laws against all forms of violence and also sexual abuse, there is still a gap in that law, in the sense during the implementation, there is a problem in proving legally and ethically the sexual harassment. So also there's also a gap in the legislation, because if you want to prove something, you want to record a video or a conversation or something, still you cannot do that by law. You need to have an official judicial authorization to record a video, otherwise you also be judged. And so how do we ensure that how do we ensure that we're breaking the silence about it, but still, protecting the identities of the people who report about it? Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman here with the blue shirt.
Yeah, I just want to find out, especially in terms of corruption among law enforcement officers. In a situation where probably the minimum wage of that officer is $50, and he has a child that has to pay for a secondary school examination, an entrance examination for the university, and the price are pegged at $70. So how would he not be corrupt in the face of such unimaginable kind of payment in terms of engaging in anti-corruption issues? We have not spoken of issues of food, accommodation, and etc. Just one issue to probably has a son or a daughter to sit for an exam, and he is paying more than what he earns. How can we combat corruption in such situation?
The compensation issue, is it not perhaps creating a conducive climate for corruption? The lady there with a red...
Good morning, everyone. I'm very privileged to be here among you today. And I am Nishta from Mauritius, and I have two comments. My first one is about women in Mauritius in high leadership roles. They are highly corrupted, as our friend Lovania just said. I think that maybe they are more corrupted than men who are in position as them. And these ladies were put in these places by men or politicians for political strategies, so that they can exert a control on them. The problem is that the population has a very bad perception of women in high position. They just assume that all women in these positions are corrupted. So when the right women reaches these positions, they face a lot of difficulties. It has become very challenging for them to get rid of this distorted image of women in high positions in Mauritius. My second comment is about sexual favors. So sometimes women have no choice. They just need to be part of the corruption system to be able to survive. For example, in Mauritius, it is very difficult to get a job in both private and public sector unless you know people. In these cases, women are most vulnerable. Often they have to indulge in sexual activities to get a job or a promotion. So we need to find solutions so that these women have choices and do not fall into the corruption system for employment purposes. So we need to aim to have a meritocracy system where you get a job or a promotion because you deserve it. So thank you very much.
How to ensure that women are not proxies of politicians, male politicians? I think that is an important question. The lady here. Oh, no, the gentleman. Yeah, the gentleman before the lady. No.
My first observation in the morning, I said that corruption is a forest or a desert that if not maneuvered or navigated well, we are going to get lost. From that background, I want to tell you that numericals, empiricals, numbers don't add up. One woman who steals, 100 men who steals, they are thieves. Corruption is so wide. My take on some of the explanations here, someone said, someone earning small, how will you imagine a president who earns what they earn, the allowances they have, but they steal from the citizens? Aren't they corrupt? We should ask ourselves. These people earn best, have good allowances, but they keep stealing from the people. My sister Kagawa has said it, involve men, involve women. Because, as I said before, some of the some rights in some societies are privileges. Who doesn't have a right to acquire a passport? But some people have to bribe to get passports. It affects men, it affects women. When we talk of sexual favors, someone who asks you for sex will ask me for money because they are not homos. They will ask for sex from a female, but they will ask money from me because they are not homos. So let us teach our girls to say no. From childhood, we tell them, say no. Other than saying it in front there, and when you go back room, you do the same. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, men have been on the front line of in leadership since the earth was created by God. Adam was the first man, he led the world. Men have been exposed like there is no cover. Let us put women in right. We'll find that most women who are in leadership will use their brothers to be corrupt and keep their properties. They are not going to do it themselves, but they will ensure their properties, their accounts. You find their names on their uncles' names, their brothers. They hide everything in that they are corrupt, but we don't see them because they are still covered and they are still few. In countries in a country where I come from, we had a minister. She borrowed from her ministry pass to go and shop. That is Rwanda. Women in procurement use their brothers to gain markets. Women propose their kins, their sisters, their brothers, their relatives in positions of leadership and management. Isn't that corruption? Corruption is not only that wrong arm that goes to the government pass. It is wide. And women are also humans. They get involved. So let us look at corruption, whether 1 or 10 or 100. We are all thieves, and they should be fought. Thank you.
Corruption is corruption, but the reality is the intention is to conscientize women who are always left behind in terms of ensuring that they take their rightful place. No one is disputing the fact that corruption is corruption, but I think in this case, the reality is in most countries, the population majority is women and they cannot be left behind. Let me take that lady and then come to the lady here in front perhaps to make comments, but the lady at the back. You, no. Yes.
Yes, I'm going to talk about what my brother there said about the law enforcement officers having to take bribes because they have families and whatever. As a law enforcement officer, I would disagree, because no law enforcement officer joins the force to live on what somebody else works for to get. Some people in my country, Seychelles, law enforcement officers, we get a salary that everybody who works complains that the salary is not enough. And just like my brother here said, a president, a minister gets a big salary and still are corrupt. So even if we get the salary that is proper, we get corrupt because opportunities arise for us to be corrupted. When a law enforcement officer bribes somebody who has committed a crime and takes the money, he doesn't take the money to keep it and save it to pay the fees for his child or her child to go to school. He takes the money because there is an opportunity and he is corrupt. It's not, there is no excuse. As a law enforcement officer, I would say there is no excuse for any law enforcement officer to be corrupt because they have to feed their families. Because we work and we get paid to feed the family. And as a woman, I would say that sexual harassment, yes, women are affected by it in many workplaces. But as a woman, I would also say that we need to teach our women, our girls, values. We need to teach